The crack of thunder tore through the darkening sky as Grace Wilson clutched her newborn daughter tighter to her chest, watching in horror as the wheel of her covered wagon splintered against the jagged rock. It was May 1872, and what had begun as a promising journey west from Missouri had descended into a nightmare on a desolate stretch of trail just 20 miles east of Watsonville, California. "Hush now, Eliza," Grace whispered to her 1-week-old infant, who miraculously remained asleep despite the chaos. Rain had begun to fall, fat droplets that promised a deluge, and Grace's heart pounded with desperation. Her husband Thomas had died of fever 3 weeks earlier, leaving her to manage the final leg of their journey alone, pregnant, grieving, and terrified. The horses whinnied nervously as another crack of lightning illuminated the landscape. Grace climbed down carefully from the wagon seat, her legs trembling beneath her. The broken wheel had collapsed entirely, leaving the wagon pitched at a dangerous angle, their belongings shifting precariously inside. "What am I to do now?" she whispered to the wind. The nearest town was too far to walk, especially with a newborn, and night was falling fast. They were completely exposed on the open plain, with only distant foothills offering any promise of shelter. Grace placed Eliza in a makeshift nest of blankets inside the wagon and began to assess the damage. The wheel had not merely broken, it had shattered, with several spokes snapped clean through and the rim split in 2 places. Without tools or knowledge to repair it, they were stranded. As the rain intensified, Grace retrieved a tarp from inside the wagon and struggled to stretch it over the exposed side, creating some semblance of shelter. Her dress was already soaked through, her hands numb with cold as she worked. Exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. She hadn't slept properly since Eliza's birth, and the strain of travel had depleted what little strength remained. The sound of hoofbeats cut through the rain. Grace froze, her hand instinctively moving toward the small pistol Thomas had insisted she keep. Bandits were a real threat, especially to a woman alone. A figure on horseback emerged from the gloom, tall and imposing against the stormy sky. As he approached, Grace could make out a broad-shouldered man in a rain-slicked duster, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "Madam." His voice was deep, carrying clearly despite the weather. "Looks like you've got yourself some trouble." Grace stepped back, keeping one hand on the wagon. "I can manage," she called back, though they both knew it was a lie. The stranger dismounted, his movements fluid and practiced. He approached slowly, hands visible. "Name's Daniel Nash. I don't mean you any harm. That wheel's beyond saving, and this storm's only getting worse." He stopped a respectful distance away, and as lightning flashed again, Grace caught her first clear glimpse of his face. His features were weathered but handsome, with keen eyes that assessed the situation rapidly. A neatly trimmed beard framed a mouth that seemed inclined towards smiling, though it remained serious now. "I've got tools. I can help," he offered, gesturing toward his saddlebags. A weak cry from inside the wagon made Grace turn. "I have a baby," she said, as if that explained her wariness, her desperation, everything. Daniel nodded, his expression softening. "All the more reason to get you both somewhere dry. There's a line shack about 2 miles back. It's not much, but it's sturdy. We can shelter there tonight, and I'll see to your wheel in the morning." Grace hesitated. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, yet necessity dictated few options. "How do I know I can trust you?" "You don't," Daniel replied honestly. "But I give you my word as a gentleman, and I'm leaving this with you." He slowly removed his revolver from its holster and extended it, handle first. "Take it, makes us even." The gesture surprised her. Grace accepted the weapon, feeling its unfamiliar weight. "I'm Grace Wilson," she finally said. "My daughter is Eliza." Daniel nodded, then turned his attention to the wagon. Let's salvage what we can and get you both to shelter before this storm worsens. With efficient movements, he helped Grace gather her most essential belongings: food, clothing, medicine, and the cradle Thomas had carved for their child. Daniel's horse, a sturdy bay gelding, carried most of their goods, while Grace clutched Eliza to her chest beneath a protective oilcloth. The journey to the line shack seemed endless. Rain lashed at them mercilessly, and Grace struggled to keep her footing in the deepening mud. Without a word, Daniel stepped closer, offering his arm for support. Pride made her hesitate, but practicality won out. His steadiness kept her upright, his presence a bulwark against the elements. The line shack appeared like a miracle, a small, rough-hewn cabin nestled against a stand of pine trees. Daniel ushered her inside, quickly lighting a lantern that revealed a spare but clean interior. A small stove, a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, and little else. It belongs to the Redwood Ranch, he explained, building a fire in the stove. They keep it stocked for their hands. I've worked for them off and on. Warmth gradually filled the room as Grace settled Eliza in a makeshift bed fashioned from a wooden crate and blankets. The baby fussed, hungry and disturbed by the change in routine. Grace unbuttoned her dress to nurse, turning away modestly. Daniel busied himself at the stove, his back firmly to her. There's coffee and some beans. Not much of a meal, but it'll warm you up. Thank you, Grace said softly. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along. Daniel shrugged, still facing away. Anyone would have done the same. No, she replied with certainty. They wouldn't. When Eliza had fallen asleep, Grace accepted a tin mug of coffee from Daniel, their fingers brushing momentarily. He had removed his duster and hat, revealing sandy hair that curled slightly at his collar. Up close, she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, laugh lines her mother would have called them. What brings you out to these parts, Mrs. Wilson? He asked, sitting across from her at the small table. Please call me Grace. The formality seemed absurd given their circumstances. My husband and I were heading to Watsonville. He had purchased land there, sight unseen. We were to start a new life. Her voice caught. Thomas died of fever 3 weeks ago near Sacramento. I had nowhere else to go but forward. Daniel's expression registered surprise. You continued alone. While expecting, Grace's chin lifted slightly. What choice did I have? Return to Missouri with nothing. I have Thomas's deed. The land is mine now, Eliza's inheritance. I intend to make something of it. That's mighty brave, Daniel said, a new respect in his voice. Foolhardy, perhaps, but brave nonetheless. And you? Grace asked, deflecting the conversation. What brought you to my rescue? Daniel sipped his coffee. I was heading to Watsonville myself. I've got business there. What kind of business? She couldn't help but be curious about this man who had appeared so providentially. A half smile curved his lips. Nothing too exciting. I'm a horse trader by profession. I've got a small herd being driven down by my partners. I rode ahead to secure grazing rights near town. The simple explanation eased some of Grace's lingering concerns. A horse trader made sense. He certainly sat a saddle like someone who'd spent his life around horses. How far is it to Watsonville from where my wagon broke down? She asked. About 20 miles, give or take. Not a hard journey under normal circumstances. He glanced toward the window where rain still pattered against the glass. But with a newborn and a broken wheel, it's complicated. Grace nodded, exhaustion washing over her. Daniel noticed immediately and stood. Take the bed. I'll make do on the floor. I couldn't. You can and you will, he said firmly. You need rest more than I do. Too tired to argue, Grace settled onto the narrow bed with Eliza beside her. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Daniel spreading his bedroll on the floor, his movements quiet and considerate. Morning brought clearing skies and the soft cooing of Eliza, who woke hungry but otherwise content. Grace found Daniel already up, tending to the fire and preparing a simple breakfast of salt pork and biscuits. "I'll head back to your wagon after we eat," he said, nodding toward the window. "Weather's clearing. With luck, I can salvage the wheel or fashion something temporary." "I should come with you," Grace said, adjusting her dress after feeding Eliza. Daniel shook his head. "No need to expose the little one to more elements. You'll both be safe here until I return." Grace wanted to protest but recognized the logic in his words. "Very well, but please take this back." She extended his revolver. "I realize now I had no cause to distrust you." Daniel considered the weapon, then shook his head. "Keep it for now. A woman alone should have protection." After breakfast, Daniel departed, promising to return by midday. Grace busied herself with caring for Eliza and tidying the cabin. She found herself wondering about Daniel Nash's life, his past, the events that had shaped him into the kind of man who would stop to help a stranded woman and child. True to his word, Daniel returned before the sun reached its zenith. His clothing was mud-splattered, and he looked weary but satisfied. "Good news and bad news," he announced, accepting the cup of coffee Grace offered. "The wheel itself is beyond repair, but I managed to retrieve all your belongings. They're secured about a quarter-mile from here. And the bad news, we're going to need a new wheel entirely. I can fashion a temporary fix that might get us to Watsonville, but it won't be elegant or particularly safe." Grace considered this. "Is there no alternative?" Daniel scratched his beard thoughtfully. "There's a homestead about 5 miles west. Fellow there might have a spare wheel or at least the materials to build one properly. I could ride there tomorrow." "And in the meantime?" Grace asked. "In the meantime, you and Eliza stay comfortable here. I've brought your trunk and provisions. The wagon itself is hidden as best I could manage." Grace felt a wave of gratitude. "You've done so much already, I don't know how to repay you." Daniel waved away her thanks. "Any decent man would do the same." "You keep saying that," Grace observed, "but in my experience, decent men are rarer than you suggest." A shadow passed across Daniel's face. "Perhaps you're right about that." They settled into an unexpectedly comfortable routine. Daniel insisted on sleeping on the floor, despite Grace's protests. He proved remarkably adept with Eliza, showing no discomfort around the infant. When Grace commented on it, he admitted that he had 5 younger siblings. "I practically raised the youngest 2 after our mother passed," he explained as he confidently cradled Eliza while Grace ate her dinner. "Pa did his best, but he was often working. It fell to me to mind the little ones." "Where are they now?" Grace asked, scattered to the winds. 2 sisters married and living in Oregon, one brother farming in Kansas, another working the railroads back east. The youngest, Josephine, is teaching school in Sacramento. "You must miss them." Daniel nodded, his eyes on Eliza. "Family's important, which is why I admire what you're doing for your daughter. It takes courage to forge ahead alone." The next morning, Daniel rode out to the homestead. Grace spent the day organizing her belongings and wondering why the hours seemed to drag in his absence. Eliza was unusually fussy, as if sensing her mother's restlessness. "He's a stranger to us," Grace told her daughter as she paced the cabin floor. "A kind one, certainly, but we mustn't become dependent. Soon we'll be in Watsonville, starting our new life." Yet even as she said the words, Grace felt a hollowness in them. The prospect of arriving in Watsonville alone, with no one to help her establish herself on Thomas's land, seemed more daunting than ever. Daniel returned at dusk, bearing not only materials for a new wheel but also fresh supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, and even a small jar of preserves. Mrs. Miller at the homestead insisted, he explained, setting the jar on the table. Said no baby should be without something sweet in the house, even if it's for her mama. Grace touched the jar, oddly moved by the thoughtfulness of a woman she'd never met. Please thank her for me when next you see her. You can thank her yourself. She's invited us to Sunday dinner once we're mobile again. Her husband's a fair wheelwright. He's coming by tomorrow to help with the repairs. True to Daniel's word, Mr. Miller arrived the following morning, a stocky man with capable hands and a no-nonsense demeanor. With Daniel's assistance, he worked on constructing a new wheel, using parts salvaged from the old one combined with the new materials. Grace prepared lunch for the men, feeling a strange sense of domesticity as she moved about the small cabin. When she brought them plates of food, she caught Daniel watching her, an unreadable expression on his face. "This wheel should get you to Watsonville without trouble," Mr. Miller announced late in the afternoon. "It's not pretty, but it's solid." "That's all that matters," Grace replied gratefully. "I can't thank you enough." Mr. Miller waved away her thanks. "Danny here did most of the work. I just supervised." After Mr. Miller departed, Daniel and Grace discussed their journey to Watsonville. "We should be able to start tomorrow if the weather holds," Daniel said. "It'll take us 2 days at an easy pace, which is best for you and Eliza." "You don't have to escort us the entire way," Grace protested. "I'm sure you have your own business to attend to." Daniel's expression turned serious. "I promised to see you safely to Watsonville, and I intend to keep that promise." Something in his tone silenced further objections. Instead, Grace found herself asking, "Tell me about Watsonville. Have you been there before?" Daniel nodded, settling into a chair. "It's a growing town. Good farmland in the valley, timber in the hills. Decent folks for the most part. It's changing, though, like everywhere else. The railroad's coming through soon." "Is that good or bad?" "Depends on who you ask. It'll bring more people, more business. But it'll change the character of the place, too." Grace thought about the land Thomas had purchased. "You know the area west of town, near the river? That's where our property is supposed to be." A flicker of something surprise, concern crossed Daniel's face. "I'm familiar with it. Good land if it's where I think. Rich soil. That's a relief. Thomas was so certain about it, but I worried that he'd been swindled." Daniel's mouth quirked into a half-smile. "It happens often enough, but the land west of town is some of the best in the county. If that's what he bought, you've got a solid start." The knowledge eased a weight Grace hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "I know nothing about farming," she admitted. "Thomas was the one with experience. I was a school teacher before we married." "Farming can be learned," Daniel said with quiet confidence. "And Watsonville could use a good teacher. The town's growing, lots of families with children." The possibility sparked hope in Grace. Perhaps she could combine both: work the land Thomas had dreamed of, while also using her teaching skills. They departed early the next morning. Daniel had rigged the wagon so that the new wheel bore less weight than the others, a precaution to ensure it lasted the journey. Grace sat beside him on the wagon seat, Eliza sleeping peacefully in a basket secured between them. The landscape gradually changed as they traveled, the open plains giving way to rolling hills dotted with oak trees. Daniel pointed out landmarks, sharing stories of his previous journeys through the area. His knowledge of the terrain impressed Grace, as did his constant vigilance. His eyes scanned the horizon frequently, and he kept his rifle within easy reach. "Are bandits a concern?" Grace asked after noticing his watchfulness. "Not as much as they once were, but it pays to be cautious," Daniel replied. The war left many men with few prospects and fewer scruples. You fought. The question slipped out before Grace could consider its propriety. Daniel nodded once, his expression shuddering. Union cavalry, not something I care to dwell on. Grace respected his reticence. Thomas, too, had rarely spoken of his war experiences. My husband served as well. He said the peace was harder than the fighting in some ways. Your husband was a wise man. Daniel's voice held a new note of respect. They made camp that evening in a small clearing beside a stream. Daniel efficiently set up a lean-to shelter for Grace and Eliza, then built a small fire. As darkness fell, the crackling flames created a circle of warmth and light that felt oddly intimate. Over a simple supper of beans and salt pork, their conversation flowed more easily than before. Daniel spoke of his travels across the West, his dreams of eventually establishing his own horse ranch. Grace shared stories of her childhood in St. Louis, her years teaching, and her courtship with Thomas. He courted me for 2 years before proposing, she said, smiling at the memory. So proper and determined to prove himself worthy, though my father approved of him from the start. He sounds like a good man, Daniel said quietly. He was. Grace glanced down at Eliza, sleeping peacefully beside her. I wish he could have seen her just once. He'd be proud of you both, Daniel said with such certainty that Grace found herself blinking back tears. The moment lingered between them, weighted with unspoken feelings. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat and stood. Dawn comes early. You should rest while you can. As Grace settled into her makeshift bed with Eliza, she found herself hyper-aware of Daniel's presence just outside the lean-to, his solid form silhouetted against the dying fire. His protection made her feel secure in a way she hadn't since Thomas's death. Yet there was something else too, a fluttering awareness that both alarmed and intrigued her. It's merely gratitude, she whispered to herself. Nothing more. But as sleep claimed her, Grace wondered if she was being entirely honest with herself. The second day of travel passed without incident. The new wheel held firm, and they made good time along the increasingly well-traveled road. By mid-afternoon, Daniel pointed to a smudge on the horizon. Watsonville, he said. We'll be there by evening. Grace felt a curious mixture of relief and regret. Their journey was ending, and with it, her time with Daniel. She'd grown accustomed to his steady presence, his quiet competence, the way his rare smiles transformed his face. What will you do once we arrive? She asked, trying to sound casual. Meet up with my partners, see to the herd, Daniel replied. Then there's that business I mentioned. He glanced at her. And you? Where will you go first? The land office, I suppose. I need to verify Thomas's deed and find the exact location of our property. Daniel nodded. I know the land agent, Benjamin Foster. Honest man. He'll help you sort things out. As they approached the town, the road became busier, wagons laden with produce, riders on horseback, even a stagecoach rattling past in a cloud of dust. Watsonville revealed itself as a bustling settlement with a main street lined with businesses, a general store, saloon, hotel, blacksmith, and various other establishments. Church spires rose above the rooftops, and neat houses spread outward from the center. It's larger than I expected, Grace remarked, taking in the sights. Like I said, it's growing, Daniel replied. The railroad survey crews were here last month. Once the tracks come through, it'll grow even faster. They stopped first at the livery stable, where Daniel arranged for Grace's horses to be cared for and the wagon stored. The owner, a burly man named Silas, greeted Daniel like an old friend. Nash, heard your boys were bringing in a herd. Been wondering when you'd show your face. Silas's eyes shifted curiously to Grace and Eliza. Mrs. Wilson and her daughter are new to town, Daniel explained simply. "I'm helping them get settled." If Silas found this unusual, he didn't comment. Instead, he tipped his hat to Grace. "Madam, welcome to Watsonville. Fine place for raising a family." "Thank you," Grace replied, adjusting Eliza in her arms. The baby had awakened and was regarding the new surroundings with wide eyes. From the livery, Daniel escorted them to a modest boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Reynolds. "Best place for a respectable lady," he explained as they approached the two-story clapboard building with its neat curtains and flower boxes. "The hotel caters more to traveling businessmen." Mrs. Reynolds proved to be a plump, efficient woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She showed Grace to a clean, comfortable room with a small adjoining chamber perfect for Eliza's cradle. "Breakfast at 7 sharp," Mrs. Reynolds informed her. "Supper at 6. Washing day is Monday, and I don't tolerate gentlemen callers after 8 in the evening." She cast a speculative glance at Daniel, who waited respectfully in the hallway. "Mr. Nash is merely an acquaintance who helped me reach town," Grace hastened to explain. "My husband passed away recently." Mrs. Reynolds' expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss, dear. A widow myself, these past 5 years. It's not an easy road, especially with a little one." She patted Grace's arm. "You rest now. Town will still be there tomorrow." After Mrs. Reynolds departed, Daniel helped bring up Grace's trunk and other belongings. In the confines of the small room, he seemed larger somehow, his presence filling the space. "I'll come by tomorrow morning," he said, standing awkwardly by the door. "Take you to the land office if you'd like." "That's very kind, but you've done more than enough already," Grace replied, though the thought of facing her new life alone suddenly seemed daunting. Daniel studied her face. "It's no trouble. Besides, I need to see Foster anyway." Relief washed through Grace. "Then I accept, thank you." An awkward silence fell between them. Daniel shifted his weight, then reached for the doorknob. "Until tomorrow, then." "Until tomorrow," Grace echoed. After he left, the room felt strangely empty. Grace busied herself unpacking essentials and settling Eliza for the night. As darkness fell over Watsonville, she stood by the window, watching the lamplights blink on throughout the town. This was her new home, the place where Eliza would grow up, where they would build the life Thomas had envisioned. Yet as she prepared for bed, Grace found her thoughts drifting not to Thomas and their plans, but to Daniel Nash and his unexpected entry into their lives. Morning arrived with the clatter of dishes from downstairs and the tantalizing smell of coffee and bacon. After feeding Eliza and dressing them both in their best remaining clothes, Grace descended to the dining room, where several other boarders were already seated at a long table. Mrs. Reynolds made introductions. Mr. Peterson, the telegraph operator, the Mrs. Hardwick, sisters who worked at the millinery shop, and Dr. Collins, the town's younger physician. All greeted Grace warmly, expressing sympathy for her widowhood and cooing appropriately over Eliza. "Mr. Nash is waiting in the parlor," Mrs. Reynolds informed Grace after breakfast. Her tone was neutral, but her raised eyebrow spoke volumes. Daniel stood when Grace entered the parlor, hat in hands. He'd clearly made an effort with his appearance. His clothes were clean and pressed, his hair neatly combed, his beard trimmed. The sight of him caused an unexpected flutter in Grace's chest. "Good morning," he said, his eyes warming as they took in Eliza. "How did you both sleep?" "Well enough," Grace replied. "Everything seems quiet after nights on the trail." "Too quiet sometimes," Daniel agreed with a small smile. Ready to see your land, the land office was located on the main street, a tidy building with a fresh coat of paint. Benjamin Foster proved to be a thin, precise man with spectacles and an air of competence. He greeted Daniel like an old acquaintance, before turning his attention to Grace. "Mrs. Wilson, my condolences on your loss," he said after examining Thomas's deed. "Your husband purchased an excellent property 50 acres along the western bend of the river. Good soil, some timber, a small orchard already established." Relief flooded through Grace. "There's a house," Foster hesitated. "There is a structure, yes." The previous owner was a bachelor who lived quite simply. It will need work to be suitable for a family. Daniel, who had been examining a map on the wall, turned. "Hadley's old place," Foster nodded. "The very same. Something passed between the men that Grace couldn't interpret." "Is there a problem with the property?" she asked. "Not at all," Foster assured her quickly. "It's just been vacant for some months. Nature tends to reclaim what's left untended." "I'd like to see it," Grace said firmly. Foster glanced at his pocket watch. "I have appointments all morning." "Perhaps tomorrow." "I can take her," Daniel interrupted. "I know the place." Foster looked relieved. "Excellent. Mrs. Wilson, I'll prepare the final transfer documents. Your husband paid in full, so it's merely a matter of recording the change in ownership." Outside the land office, Grace turned to Daniel. "You know my property," he nodded, helping her into a buggy he'd hired for the day. "Everyone knew old Hadley. Cantankerous but fair. Dropped dead in his fields last fall, no family to claim the place. It's good land, he just didn't do much with it, besides that orchard he was so proud of." As they drove west out of town, the valley opened before them, a patchwork of farms and orchards bordered by rolling hills. The river wound like a silver ribbon through the landscape, and Daniel pointed to a distant cluster of trees. "That's it there. The Hadley place, your place now." The property revealed itself gradually as they approached. The orchard came first, 24 apple and pear trees, neglected but still living. Beyond that stood a small cabin constructed of rough-hewn logs, its roof sagging in one corner. A barn and corral stood nearby, in somewhat better condition than the house. Grace's heart sank as they pulled up before the cabin. The door hung askew on leather hinges, and weeds had grown up around the foundation. Through the open doorway, she could glimpse a Spartan interior, a single room with a stone fireplace, dirt floor, and little else. "It's not what I expected," she admitted, clutching Eliza closer. Daniel surveyed the property with a critical eye. "It needs work, certainly, but the bones are good. That barn is solid, and the well is one of the best in the county. Hadley was particular about his water." Grace summoned her courage and stepped inside the cabin. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the roof, illuminating a space that was bare but larger than she'd initially thought. A crude table stood against one wall, a rope bed frame against another. The fireplace dominated the third wall, with a few rusted cooking implements hanging nearby. "Thomas said there was a house," she said softly. "This is hardly, it can be made into a proper home," Daniel said, his deep voice gentle. "The location is perfect, high enough to avoid spring flooding, sheltered from winter winds by those hills." He gestured toward the western boundary. "Good line of sight in all directions. Plenty of timber on the property for improvements." His practicality steadied her. Grace moved to the small window and looked out across what was now her land. Despite the cabin's condition, she could see the potential, the fertile soil, the sturdy barn, the orchard that could provide both food and income. "I have some savings," she said, thinking aloud. "Not much, but perhaps enough to hire help with repairs." Daniel stepped beside her at the window. "Watsonville folks are neighborly. A barn raising isn't uncommon when someone new settles in, especially," he stopped abruptly, "especially for a widow with a child." Grace finished for him, a note of defiance entering her voice. Daniel met her gaze directly. "I was going to say especially for someone willing to work alongside their neighbors, Pride has its place, Mrs. Wilson, but it won't put a roof over your head." The blunt truth of his words silenced her protest. After a moment, Grace nodded. "You're right, of course. I'm not used to accepting help." "Few worthwhile people are," Daniel replied, "but there's no shame in it." They explored the rest of the property together, the barn with its empty stalls and hayloft, the corral that needed only minor repairs, the well with its sweet, cold water. The more Grace saw, the more she could envision what might be possible here. "The apple trees will bear fruit this fall," Daniel noted as they walked through the overgrown orchard. "Hadley was known for his cider. You could continue that tradition." The idea appealed to Grace. "I made preserves back home. Perhaps I could sell those as well." "Town's general store would likely buy whatever you produce," Daniel confirmed. "Fredericks is always looking for local goods to stock." By the time they returned to the buggy, Grace's initial disappointment had transformed into cautious optimism. Yes, the cabin needed significant work, but the land itself was everything Thomas had believed it would be. With determination and help, they could make a life here. "It won't be easy," Daniel cautioned as they drove back toward town. "Homesteading never is, even with a proper start." "Few worthwhile things are easy," Grace replied, echoing his earlier sentiment. The unexpected smile her response elicited warmed her more than it should have. Over the next few days, Grace established herself in Watsonville. She completed the paperwork at the land office, opened an account at the bank, and introduced herself to key figures in town: the minister, the doctor, the general store owner. Everywhere she went, people proved friendly, if curious, about the young widow with the newborn. Daniel remained a constant presence, introducing her to people he knew, helping her navigate the complexities of her new community. Grace learned that he was well respected in Watsonville, known for fair dealing and reliability. His horse trading business regularly brought him to town, though he had no permanent residence there. "My partners and I move with the seasons," he explained over supper at the boarding house, where Mrs. Reynolds had invited him to join them. "Buy horses in Nevada and Oregon, bring them south for sale in California, then back north again." "It sounds lonely," Grace observed. A shadow crossed Daniel's face. "It suits me." Yet Grace noticed how at ease he seemed in Watsonville, how many people greeted him by name, how naturally he slipped into conversation with locals. He didn't seem like a man who preferred solitude. When Grace mentioned plans to make the cabin habitable, word spread quickly through town. Before she knew what was happening, a work party had been organized for the following Saturday. Women promised food, men offered labor, and the minister announced it from the pulpit on Sunday. "I told you Watsonville was neighborly," Daniel said when Grace expressed surprise at the response. "But they hardly know me," she protested. "They know enough," he replied simply. "And they know what it's like to start with nothing." The day of the work party dawned clear and mild. Daniel arrived at the boarding house early to drive Grace and Eliza to the property. Already, wagons were headed in the same direction, loaded with tools, lumber, and supplies. By mid-morning, the cabin site buzzed with activity. Men swarmed over the roof, replacing rotten boards and shingling. Others dug post holes for a proper porch, while still others leveled the interior floor in preparation for wooden planking. Women set up a cooking area, where pots bubbled and children ran errands. Grace found herself at the center of a whirlwind of generosity. Mrs. Fredericks from the general store presented her with curtain material. The blacksmith's wife brought a rocking chair. The millers arrived with a small cook stove to replace the open hearth. "This is too much," Grace protested when she saw the stove being unloaded. "Nonsense, Mrs. Miller replied firmly. "Samuel built a new one for us last winter. This one's still got years of use left, and you can't be cooking over an open fire with a baby in the house." Throughout it all, Daniel worked tirelessly, shingling, sawing, hauling water, directing efforts where needed. Grace noticed how naturally he assumed leadership, how others deferred to his judgment without question. He seemed different here among people he knew, more relaxed, more himself. By sunset, the transformation was remarkable. The cabin sported a new roof, a small porch, a level wooden floor, and tight-fitting windows with glass panes. The interior walls had been chinked with fresh mud and straw, and a proper door hung on metal hinges. It was still a simple dwelling, but now it was weathertight and comfortable. "You can move in whenever you're ready," Daniel told Grace as the last wagons departed. They stood together on the new porch, watching the sunset paint the hills gold. Eliza slept peacefully in the crook of Grace's arm, exhausted from a day of being passed among admiring women. "I can't believe what they've done," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "Why would they do so much for a stranger?" Daniel leaned against the porch post, his expression thoughtful. "It's not entirely altruistic. Every new settler makes the community stronger. Every farm that succeeds helps everyone. Besides," he added with a small smile, "they're investing in you as much as the property. The school teacher from St. Louis who might educate their children someday." Grace looked at him in surprise. "How did they know I was a teacher? Word gets around." Daniel shrugged. "And I might have mentioned it to a few people." The knowledge that he'd spoken about her to others, that he'd highlighted her skills rather than her widowhood or helplessness, warmed her deeply. "Thank you for that." Daniel straightened, suddenly awkward. "I should get you back to town. It's getting late." On the ride back to the boarding house, Grace found herself wondering about Daniel's plans. His partners had arrived in Watsonville 2 days earlier with the horse herd, and the animals were now corralled at the edge of town. The business that had brought him here was concluding. "When will you be leaving?" she asked, the question emerging more abruptly than she'd intended. Daniel's hands tightened on the reins. "Soon. We've got buyers coming to look at the horses tomorrow. Once the sales are complete, we'll move on." "I see." Grace focused on Eliza, adjusting the blanket around her sleeping form. "You've been very kind, Mr. Nash. I don't know how I would have managed without your help." "You'd have managed," he replied with certainty. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Mrs. Wilson." The formal address stung after the ease that had developed between them. "I thought we'd moved beyond such formalities, Daniel." He glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "Perhaps that's not wise." The remainder of the journey passed in silence. At the boarding house, Daniel helped her down from the buggy but declined Mrs. Reynolds's invitation to supper. "Business to attend to," he explained, not quite meeting Grace's eyes. "Good night, Mrs. Wilson. Miss Eliza." As he drove away, Grace felt a hollow sensation in her chest. She had become accustomed to his presence, to his steady support. The prospect of his departure left her feeling adrift in a way that seemed disproportionate to their brief acquaintance. Just gratitude, she reminded herself as she prepared for bed. Nothing more. But as she lay awake that night, Grace admitted the truth she'd been avoiding. Somewhere between the broken wagon wheel and the rebuilt cabin, she had developed feelings for Daniel Nash that went well beyond gratitude. Feelings that were inappropriate for a recent widow, feelings that were almost certainly unrequited, feelings that left her ashamed and confused. "It doesn't matter," she whispered into the darkness. "He's leaving and I have Eliza to think about. There's no place for such foolishness." The following days passed in a blur of activity. Grace purchased essential supplies for the cabin, arranged for her wagon and horses to be moved to her property, and prepared to leave the boarding house. Daniel did not call again. though she heard through town gossip that the horse sale had been successful. 4 days after the work party, Grace and Eliza moved into their new home. Mrs. Reynolds insisted on accompanying them, helping arrange the modest furniture and ensuring everything was properly set up, before departing with promises to visit soon. Left alone for the first time in her new home, Grace felt a curious mixture of pride and trepidation. The cabin was simple but comfortable now, with her trunk at the foot of the bed, Thomas's books on a small shelf, and Eliza's cradle near the stove. Through the windows, she could see her land stretching toward the river, her responsibility, her future. As twilight deepened, Grace lit the lamp and settled into the rocking chair to nurse Eliza. The night sounds were different here than in town, the soft lowing of her 2 cows in the barn, the rustle of wind through the orchard, the distant murmur of the river. It was peaceful but isolated in a way that made her acutely aware of her vulnerability. A knock at the door startled her so badly that Eliza pulled away from her breast with a cry of protest. Grace hastily adjusted her clothing and rose, her heart pounding. "Who's there?" she called, reaching for Thomas's pistol on the shelf. "It's Daniel," came the familiar, deep voice. Grace yanked open the door, relief and confusion mingling in her chest. Daniel stood on the porch, hat in hand, a burlap sack at his feet. "I heard you'd moved out here today," he said by way of explanation. "Thought I'd check that everything was in order." "We're managing," Grace replied, stepping back to allow him entry. "Mrs. Reynolds helped us settle in." Daniel nodded, remaining on the threshold. "That's good. I brought you something." He lifted the sack and extended it toward her. "Seeds for a kitchen garden. It's late to plant, but most of these should do fine if you get them in the ground soon." The thoughtful gift touched Grace deeply. "Thank you. Won't you come in?" After a moment's hesitation, Daniel stepped inside. His gaze swept the cabin, noting the small changes Grace had already made to make it a home: the curtains at the windows, the quilt on the bed, the arrangement of cooking utensils near the stove. "It looks good," he said approvingly. "You've made it your own already." Eliza fussed in her cradle and Daniel's expression softened. He crossed to her and reached down, allowing the baby to grasp his finger. "She's growing already." "Babies do that," Grace replied, unable to suppress a smile at his obvious affection for Eliza. A comfortable silence fell between them as Daniel continued to let Eliza clutch his finger, making gentle sounds of greeting to her. Finally, he straightened and turned to Grace. "I wanted to tell you myself I'm not leaving Watsonville after all." The news caught Grace by surprise. "Your business. My partners are continuing north with the remaining horses," Daniel explained. "I've decided to stay on, at least for a while. Mr. Fredericks offered me a position managing his new livery stable. It seems he's expanding with the railroad coming." Hope flickered in Grace's chest, though she tried to temper it. "That sounds like a good opportunity." "It is." Daniel hesitated, then continued more carefully. "It also means I'll be nearby should you need any help with the property. Not that you need looking after," he added hastily. "But some tasks are easier with an extra pair of hands." The offer hung between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Grace studied Daniel's face, trying to discern his true intentions. "That's very neighborly of you," she said cautiously. A fleeting expression of disappointment crossed Daniel's features before his usual composure returned. "As I said, Watsonville is a neighborly place." He moved toward the door, and Grace felt a moment of panic at the thought of his departure. "Would you stay for supper?" she blurted. "It's nothing fancy, just rabbit stew and biscuits, but there's plenty." Daniel paused, his hand on the doorknob. "Are you sure that's appropriate, Mrs. Wilson?" The formality stung. "I think we've moved beyond concerns of propriety, Mr. Nash," Grace replied with more heat than she'd intended. You've seen me at my most vulnerable, helped deliver me from certain disaster, and worked alongside half the town to put a roof over my head. I believe we can share a meal as friends without scandal." A slow smile spread across Daniel's face, transforming his serious features. "When you put it that way, how can I refuse?" The meal was simple but companionable. They talked easily of practical matters: the garden Grace planned to plant, repairs still needed for the barn, the best source of firewood on the property. As darkness fell completely outside, the cabin grew increasingly cozy, the lamplight creating a warm circle that seemed to contain just the two of them. When Daniel finally rose to leave, Grace felt reluctant to end the evening. She walked him to the door, Eliza sleeping peacefully in her cradle. "Thank you for checking on us," she said softly, "and for the seeds, and for staying in Watsonville." Daniel studied her face in the lamplight. "Grace," he began, then stopped, seeming to wrestle with his thoughts. "I want to be honest with you. My decision to stay wasn't just about Frederick's offer." Her heart quickened. "No, no." He took a deep breath. "I've grown fond of you and Eliza, more than is probably proper given your situation. I know it's too soon after your loss, and I wouldn't presume to, Daniel." Grace cut him off, her voice trembling slightly. "I've grown fond of you too." The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and momentous. Daniel's expression shifted from uncertainty to cautious hope. "I don't want to rush you or dishonor your husband's memory, but I'd like the chance to call on you properly when you feel ready." Grace thought of Thomas, his kind face, his dreams for their future. What would he have wanted for her and Eliza, left alone in this new place? Surely not isolation and perpetual mourning. "I would like that," she said finally. "But you're right, I need time. For Eliza's sake as much as my own." Daniel nodded, relief evident in his posture. "Time is something I can give." He reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. "Good night, Grace." "Good night, Daniel." After he left, Grace stood on the porch watching his figure disappear into the darkness, her heart lighter than it had been in months. The future that had seemed so daunting just days ago now held a glimmer of something new, not replacing what she had lost, but building something different, something that might bring joy again. As spring gave way to summer, Grace and Eliza settled into life on their small farm. The garden Daniel had helped her plant flourished, providing fresh vegetables for their table. The two cows gave milk enough for their needs and a small surplus to sell in town. The orchard, pruned and tended under Daniel's guidance, promised a good harvest in the fall. True to his word, Daniel called regularly but respectfully. Sometimes he brought small gifts: a jar of honey, a length of ribbon for Eliza, flower seeds for the garden border. Other times he simply offered his labor, repairing fences or helping clear additional land for planting. His visits became the highlight of Grace's week, anticipated with an excitement she gradually stopped feeling guilty about. Eliza thrived in the country air, growing plump and strong. She learned to smile, then laugh, and finally to recognize faces lighting up with particular delight whenever Daniel appeared. For his part, Daniel showed remarkable patience with the baby, never minding when she grabbed his beard or drooled on his shirt. "You're good with her," Grace remarked one evening as they sat on the porch after supper, watching the sunset while Daniel held Eliza. "Most men are awkward around infants." Daniel looked down at the baby cradled in his arms. "She makes it easy. Knows what she wants and lets you know it too, just like her mother." The teasing compliment brought a blush to Grace's cheeks. These moments of easy intimacy had become more frequent between them, speaking to a deepening connection that went beyond mere friendship. By late summer, Grace had established herself in the community. She began tutoring several local children whose families lived too far from town for regular schooling. The small income supplemented what she earned from selling milk, eggs, and garden produce at the weekly market. Daniel's position at the livery stable evolved into a partnership with Mr. Fredericks, who recognized his knowledge of horses and business acumen. The arrangement allowed Daniel to purchase a small property at the edge of town, a cottage with enough land for a few horses of his own. "It's not much," he told Grace when he invited her to see it, "but it's the first place that's truly been mine." Grace understood the pride in his voice. "It's a good start," she said, echoing what he had once said about her own property. As autumn approached, bringing with it the harvest season, Grace found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed in just a few months. The grief of losing Thomas remained, but it no longer dominated her existence. She had built a new life for herself and Eliza, not the one she had planned, but one with its own satisfactions and joys. And increasingly, those joys were connected to Daniel's presence in their lives. The apple harvest provided the perfect opportunity for their relationship to deepen further. Daniel arrived early one Saturday morning with a borrowed cider press, ready to help turn Hadley's famous orchard into a profitable venture for Grace. Other neighbors joined them, making the work into a social occasion. Men climbed ladders to pick the highest fruits while women and children gathered those within reach. By midday, bushel baskets overflowed with red and golden apples, their sweet scent filling the air. Grace worked alongside Daniel at the cider press, feeding in washed apples while he turned the crank that crushed them. The juice flowed amber and sweet into waiting buckets, to be boiled down for apple butter or fermented into hard cider. "Hadley would approve," Daniel commented as they paused for water. "He was particular about his pressing technique." "Did you know him well?" Grace asked, wiping her brow with her apron. Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Well enough. He gave me my first job when I drifted into these parts after the war, taught me about horses, about land. He was a hard man but fair." The casual revelation of this connection surprised Grace. "You worked this very land?" "For 2 seasons," Daniel confirmed. "Hadley let me live in the barn loft while I saved for my first string of horses." He glanced around the property, a small smile playing at his lips. "Never thought I'd be back here like this." Grace studied him with new understanding. "Is that why you stopped to help me on the trail?" "Because you knew the land was Hadley's old place." Daniel met her gaze directly. "I stopped because a woman with a newborn needed help. Learning later that you were headed for Hadley's place was just providence, maybe." The word hung between them, weighted with possibility. Providence, divine guidance, fate, the hand of God directing their paths to intersect. "You believe in that?" Grace asked softly. "In providence?" Daniel was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the distant hills. "I didn't," he finally said. "Not after what I saw in the war." But then, he turned to look at her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. "Then I found you stranded on that trail, and everything changed." Grace's heart quickened at the raw honesty in his voice. Before she could respond, Eliza's cry rose from the basket where she had been napping in the shade. The moment broke, but something had shifted between them, a deeper truth acknowledged, if not yet fully explored. The cider making continued until dusk, resulting in gallons of fresh juice and dozens of jars of apple butter. When the last neighbor had departed, Grace and Daniel sat exhausted but satisfied on the porch steps, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue sky. "Thank you," Grace said, leaning slightly against his solid shoulder. "I couldn't have done this alone." "You're not alone anymore," Daniel replied simply. The words warmed her more than any declaration of feeling could have. It was true, she was no longer alone. She had Eliza, this community, and most importantly, she had Daniel beside her. Grace turned to face him, gathering her courage. Daniel, I've been thinking. It's been 6 months since Thomas passed. Eliza and I have established ourselves here. And you, she paused, searching for the right words, you've become essential to us both. Daniel's expression grew serious, intent. What are you saying, Grace? I'm saying that I'm ready, she replied softly. Ready for whatever this is between us to grow, if that's still what you want. For answer, Daniel reached for her hand, his calloused palm warm against her skin. It's all I've wanted since that first night in the line shack, when you faced down a storm with nothing but courage and that tiny baby in your arms. The admission stole Grace's breath. That long. Daniel nodded, a rueful smile playing at his lips. That long, though I tried mightily not to show it. You succeeded, Grace assured him with a small laugh. I had no idea until much later. Good, he replied seriously. It wouldn't have been right, not then. Grace appreciated his respect for her mourning, for the complex emotions that came with building a new life from the ashes of what had been lost. It was one of the many things she had come to admire about him, his patience, his understanding, his fundamental decency. And now? She asked, suddenly shy despite her boldness in initiating this conversation. Daniel's free hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle as a whisper. Now, if you'll permit me, I'd very much like to court you properly, Grace Wilson. I'd like that, she whispered. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished. Grace held her ground, heart pounding as his lips met hers in a kiss that was tender, reverent, and full of promise. When they parted, Daniel rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her face. I should go, he said reluctantly. Before I forget my good intentions. Grace nodded, though she was reluctant to end this perfect moment. Sunday dinner, she suggested. After church, Mrs. Reynolds has been asking to see Eliza again. Sunday, Daniel agreed, rising and helping her to her feet. I'll call for you at the church. As she watched him ride away, Grace felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of possibility, of joy reclaimed from sorrow's grasp. Inside the cabin, Eliza slept peacefully, unaware of the momentous shift in her mother's heart. Your father would want us to be happy, Grace whispered to her sleeping daughter. He would approve of Daniel, I think. The following weeks brought a sweet evolution to their relationship. Daniel called formally on Sundays, taking Grace and Eliza for buggy rides or walks along the river. Other days he might stop by with a needed item or to help with a farm chore, staying for supper and lingering afterward for conversation on the porch. Their courtship became the subject of gentle, approving gossip in Watsonville. The widow and the horse trader both respected, both deserving of happiness after their respective hardships. Even Mrs. Reynolds, initially protective of Grace's reputation, mellowed after observing Daniel's respectful attentions. He's a good man, she pronounced one afternoon when Grace brought Eliza to visit. Not perfect, mind you got a temper when pushed from what I hear, but solid, the kind who stands by his word. Yes, Grace agreed simply. He is. As autumn deepened, bringing color to the hills and a nip to the morning air, Daniel began to speak more concretely about the future. They sat before the fire one evening after Eliza had been put to bed, their hands intertwined as they discussed the coming winter. The cabin is snug now, but that west wall needs additional reinforcement before the heavy rains, Daniel observed. I could do it next weekend if you've got the materials. Grace nodded, grateful for his practical foresight. I've been saving for improvements. The cider sales were better than expected. Daniel hesitated, then pressed on. Grace, I've been thinking about the future, her pulse quickened. Yes, I love you, he said simply, directly. I love Eliza as if she were my own. I want to build a life with you both if you'll have me. Though she had anticipated this moment, the reality of it still left Grace breathless. "Are you proposing, Daniel Nash?" A smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I believe I am, though perhaps not as eloquently as you deserve." Grace squeezed his hand. "Eloquence is overrated. Honesty matters more." "Then, honestly, Grace Wilson, will you marry me? Let me be a father to Eliza, a partner to you in whatever life brings." Tears pricked at Grace's eyes as she nodded. "Yes, yes, I will." Daniel gathered her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the emotion words couldn't express. When they finally parted, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. "I've been carrying this for weeks, waiting for the right moment." Inside was a ring, a simple gold band set with a small but perfect sapphire. "It was my mother's," Daniel explained as he slipped it onto Grace's finger. "The only thing of value she left behind. She would have wanted you to have it." Grace admired the ring, this tangible symbol of commitment and future. "It's beautiful. I'll treasure it always." They were married 2 weeks later in the Watsonville church, with Eliza in Grace's arms and what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Mrs. Reynolds wept openly, while Mr. Fredericks beamed with satisfaction at having played matchmaker by offering Daniel that position at the livery. After a brief honeymoon in Sacramento, where they visited Daniel's sister Josephine, the newlyweds returned to face their first decision: where to live. Daniel's cottage in town was newer and more comfortable, but Grace's farm represented her independence and Eliza's inheritance. "We could sell one property," Daniel suggested as they discussed options over breakfast in Grace's now their cabin. Grace shook her head. "I don't want to sell either. This land was Thomas's dream for Eliza, and your cottage represents your first real root since the war. Both matter." Daniel considered this, impressed by her insight. "What do you propose then?" "We keep both for now," Grace said practically. "Live here because the farm needs daily attention, but maintain your place in town for when business keeps you late or weather makes travel difficult." The solution was pragmatic and spoke to their shared value of hard work and planning for the future. Daniel agreed readily, once again reminded of why he had fallen in love with this remarkable woman. Winter brought its challenges: days of driving rain that turned the roads to mud, a brief but bitter cold snap that threatened the livestock, sickness that swept through town and didn't spare their household. Through it all, their partnership deepened, each challenge faced together strengthening the bond between them. On Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fire with Eliza playing contentedly at their feet, Grace shared news that brought tears to Daniel's eyes. "We'll be welcoming a new member to our family next summer," she told him, placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Eliza will have a brother or sister." Daniel gathered her close, overcome with emotion. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, "for giving me a family, for trusting me with your heart." Grace smiled, thinking of the broken wagon wheel that had stranded her on that lonely trail months ago. What had seemed like disaster had instead been the beginning of this new life, one filled with love and promise, and the deep satisfaction of building something lasting together. "You remember what you said about Providence?" she asked, leaning into his embrace. Daniel nodded, stroking her hair. "I remember. I believe in it now, too," Grace said softly. "How else can we explain a broken wheel leading to so much happiness?" 5 years later, the Nash family gathered on the porch of their expanded farmhouse, watching a summer sunset paint the valley gold. Grace sat in her rocking chair, watching as Daniel played with their children on the lawn. 5-year-old Eliza, her blonde curls flying as she chased her 3-year-old brother Thomas, named for the father he would never know, and baby Rebecca, just beginning to toddle after her siblings. The farm had prospered under their joint stewardship. The original cabin had been incorporated into a larger structure, with proper bedrooms for the children, and a dedicated schoolroom where Grace now taught not only her own children but 6 others from neighboring farms. The orchard had doubled in size, and Daniel's selective breeding program had established a reputation for quality horses that brought buyers from as far as San Francisco. Their marriage had deepened through joy and sorrow, alike the birth of their children, the loss of Daniel's youngest sister to influenza, the fire that had destroyed their barn one terrible night, and the community that had rallied to rebuild it within a week. Through it all, they had faced life as partners, their love growing stronger with each passing season. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked, climbing the porch steps to stand beside her. His hair showed touches of gray now at the temples, and the sun had etched new lines around his eyes, but he remained as handsome to Grace as the day he'd appeared on that stormy trail. "About broken wagon wheels and Providence," Grace replied with a smile, reaching for his hand. "And how the worst day of my life became the beginning of the best." Daniel bent to kiss her, a tender gesture as natural as breathing after years of marriage. "I thank God every day for that broken wheel," he murmured against her lips. Inside the house, their future stretched before them: dinner to prepare, children to bathe, stories to read, plans to make for tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow. Outside, their land flourished, testament to their shared labor and vision. And between them flowed the deep, abiding love that had begun in crisis and grown into the foundation of everything they had built together. As twilight gathered and Daniel called the children in for supper, Grace offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought them here from a broken wagon wheel on a lonely trail to this rich, full life they had created together. Providence, indeed.